In the year 2026, we view the choice of a life partner as the ultimate expression of personal freedom. A swipe, a coffee date, a private yes. But 900 years ago, in the shadow of the Roman Colosseum, saying "I do" wasn't an act of love. It was a high-stakes transfer of property where your own consent was often the very last thing that mattered. If you think modern dating is high pressure, imagine a world where your marriage was a legal contract, signed by your father before you were old enough to understand what a husband even was. Close your eyes and breathe in the air of Rome in the year 1140. It does not smell like the Rome you know. There is no scent of roasting espresso or expensive perfume wafting through the Via del Corso. Instead, the air is thick with the heavy, humid stench of the Tiber River, and mixed with the smell of wood smoke and the sharp tang of livestock driven through the Forum. You are standing in the Rione Parione, one of the most densely packed districts of the city. To your left, the massive stone ruins of a Roman theatre have been swallowed by the earth, repurposed as the foundation for a cluster of cramped, timber-framed houses. You hear the rhythmic clack-clack of a weaver's loom from an open window, and the shouting of a fruit seller pushing a cart over uneven, broken basalt paving stones. Stones laid 1,000 years prior by the Caesars. The city is a marmoreal desert, a skeleton of ancient greatness being picked over by its medieval survivors. There are no wide, romantic boulevards here. The streets are narrow, winding canyons of mud and stone where the sun rarely touches the ground. In this cramped and vertical world, everyone knows your business. Privacy is a luxury that doesn't exist. And today, in the small church of San Lorenzo, a girl of 13 is being led by her father to meet a man in his 30s. They are about to enter a contract that will dictate the rest of her life. And in the eyes of 12th century Rome, her silence is as good as a yes. It is the mid-12th century. Rome is a city in a strange state of limbo. It is no longer the capital of a global empire, nor is it yet the polished Renaissance jewel of the popes. It is a city of towers. Great noble families, the Pierleoni, the Frangipani, the Colonna, have built massive stone fortresses directly into the ancient ruins. They fight bitter, bloody street wars for control of the city's resources and the papacy itself. In 1140, the city is pulsing with a new kind of energy. As the commune of Rome is beginning to stir, a revolutionary movement of merchants and minor nobles trying to reclaim the city from the absolute rule of the Pope. But while the politics in the streets are shifting toward liberty, the politics of the home remain absolute. Control is the currency of the 12th century, and the most valuable asset any family possesses isn't gold or silk. It is the reproductive and alliance-building potential of their children. To understand marriage in this era, you have to stop thinking of it as a romantic union and start seeing it as a peace treaty or a corporate merger. If you were born into a mid-level merchant or noble family in Rome during this period, your education was geared entirely toward your social role. For a boy, this meant the trivium, grammar, logic, art, and rhetoric, often taught by a local cleric. You were being prepared to argue in the courts or manage the family's complex ledgers. For a girl, school happened within the walls of the home or a nearby convent. Education wasn't about expanding the mind. It was about domestic administration. You learned how to manage servants, how to spin wool, and how to navigate the complex social hierarchies of the Roman neighborhood. By the age of 7, the age of reason in the eyes of the church, you were already being discussed as a pawn in the family's next move. In 2026, we propose with a ring and a question. In 1140 Rome, the process began with the desponsatio, the betrothal. This was a legal ceremony, often involving the exchange of a god's penny or a small down payment on the dowry, and historians often debate how much consent actually existed. According to the evolving canon law of the time, specifically the writings of the legal scholar Gratian, who was active right around this period, a marriage required the consent of the parties. On paper, this sounds modern. The church technically argued that a father could not force his daughter to marry against her will. However, the reality of the Roman street was very different. Consent was often interpreted as lack of vocal objection. If a girl stood in the church and did not scream or run away, she had consented. In a society where your father controlled your food, your housing, and your physical safety, the freedom to say no was an illusion. The age gap was a tool of this control. It was common for men in their late 20s or 30s, who had finally established their careers or inherited property, to marry girls of 12, 13, or 14. This gap ensured a power imbalance that made disobedience almost unthinkable. Let's look at the glamour of the day. In 2026, a bride might spend months on skin care and hair. In 1140, the ritual was different. While the myth persists that medieval people never bathed, Romans lived amongst the ruins of the greatest baths in history. While the massive imperial thermae were in ruins, smaller private balnea or neighborhood bathhouses still functioned. A bride would be scrubbed with lye soap and scented with herbs like lavender or mint to mask the ever-present smell of wood smoke. Her hair wouldn't be cut. It would be braided with silk ribbons, a sign of her virginity and status. And her dress wouldn't be white. White was nearly impossible to keep clean in a city of mud. Instead, she would wear the deepest, richest color her family could afford, usually a heavy wool or silk, dyed in madder red or woad blue. Once the ceremony was over, the couple didn't head to a private villa. They likely moved into the husband's family compound. In Rome, these were often tower houses, multi-story stone structures designed for defense. Life was communal. You didn't just marry a man, you married his mother, his brothers, and his business partners. The intimacy we value today, the private conversation between two spouses, was rare. You slept in a room with others. You ate at a communal table. Your primary job was to produce an heir to ensure the family's tower remained occupied and defended. While we in 2026 debate red flags and compatibility, the 12th century Roman was navigating a legal minefield. By 1150, the church was trying to assert itself as the ultimate authority over marriage, taking power away from the clan leaders and fathers. This created a fascinating, often invisible conflict in the streets of Rome. The legal scholar Gratian, working in nearby Bologna, published the Decretum around 1140. It was the first time consent was codified as the essential element of a marriage. To the church, a marriage was a sacrament, not just a property transfer. This meant that if a girl could prove she was forced, if she had been physically dragged to the altar, or if her "I do" was whispered under the threat of a blade, the marriage could technically be annulled. But here is the contrast. How does a 13-year-old girl in a medieval tower house find a lawyer? How does she walk through streets controlled by her father's armed guards to reach a bishop's court? For the vast majority, consent remained a silent, terrifying submission. Historians often look at letters of complaint and court records from this era, which reveal a world of conditional marriages. Sometimes a woman would wait years, until her father died, to finally testify that she never consented, using the church's own laws to escape a man she had lived with for a decade. Why the massive age gap? In the Roman commune, life was violent. A man wasn't considered ready for marriage until he could defend a home and navigate the city's guild politics. This usually happened in his late 20s. A girl, however, was seen as a liability to be settled as soon as she was physically capable of childbearing. In modern Rome, the average age for a first marriage is over 30 for both genders. In 1140, a 30-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl was the standard for social responsibility. To the medieval mind, this wasn't predatory. It was orderly. It ensured the bride was malleable, easier to integrate into the husband's family hierarchy without the interference of her own developed personality. Intimacy in the 12th century was never truly private. In 2026, the bedroom is a sanctuary. In medieval Rome, the consummation was a communal concern. While the bedding ceremony became more elaborate in the later Middle Ages, even in 1140, the neighborhood was watching. There was a legal necessity to prove the marriage was perfected. If a couple couldn't produce a child, or if the husband was impotent, the marriage could be dissolved. This put immense pressure on young couples. Imagine the psychological weight. You are 13, married to a stranger twice your age, living in a room separated from your in-laws by only a heavy linen curtain, and the entire survival of your family's political alliance depends on what happens in that bed. What fueled these lives? A Roman's diet in 1140 was a shadow of the ancient imperial abundance. There was no grain arriving from Egypt. Instead, they ate pottage, a thick stew of barley, broad beans, and whatever seasonal greens could be grown in the disabitato, the abandoned areas within the city walls. Meat was a luxury, usually salted pork or goat. Old wine was the primary hydration, but it wasn't the refined vintage of modern Italy. It was thick, often sour, and watered down to kill the bacteria in the Tiber-fed wells. This was a world of slow energy. People worked from sunrise to sunset because the cost of olive oil and tallow candles was too high to waste on late-night leisure. When the sun went down, the city went dark, and the intimacy of the home began by necessity. In 2026, an appealing man might be judged by his career, his humor, or his digital presence. In 1140 Rome, attraction was inseparable from security. A responsible man was a man who could hold his own in a street fight. Because Rome lacked a professional police force, your safety depended on the fama, the reputation, of the men in your family. An appealing husband was one who was well connected. He belonged to a powerful parish or a rising merchant guild. He was grave, a Latin-derived term meaning serious, heavy with responsibility, and not prone to the flighty emotions of youth. Responsibility was measured by how much space you occupied in the city. Did you contribute to the building of the neighborhood church? Did you show up when the storm bell rang to defend the city gates? If a man failed these public tests, he was a failure at home. A woman's appeal was similarly tied to her honesta, her public modesty, and her ability to manage the inner economy of the house so her husband could focus on the outer economy of the street. We must be honest about what is lost in the records. We have the laws and we have the architecture, but we rarely have the voices of the women themselves. Historians infer their experiences from the petitions for nullity that appear in later centuries. We see cases of clandestine marriages, couples who ran away to marry in secret because they did love each other, defying their father's plans. These were the rebels of the 12th century. If caught, the consequences were dire. The man could be beaten or sued for theft of the woman's dowry, and the woman could be disowned, leaving her with no social safety net in a city where an unattached woman was seen as a vagrant or worse. In modern 2026, when a relationship fails, we have no-fault divorce and digital mediation. In 1140 Rome, a failed marriage was a localized earthquake. Because families were so tightly knit, often living in the same curtis or courtyard, a dispute between a husband and wife could spark a vendetta between entire city blocks. One of the most unique and documented ways a marriage could be challenged was through the claim of sorcery or maleficium. If a man was unable to consummate the marriage with his young bride, it wasn't seen as a psychological issue or a result of the extreme age gap. It was often blamed on a curse. This led to trial by inspection, a humiliating process where a panel of honest women, matrons of the parish, would physically examine the couple to determine if the marriage was valid. Contrast this with our modern medical privacy. In the 12th century, your most intimate failures were a matter of public testimony in the bishop's court. The consequence of this was a society where everyone was constantly performing. You had to look capable, you had to act fertile, and you had to maintain the farmer of a functional household, or you risked losing your legal standing in the commune. As we walk through the modern ruins of the Forum today, we see the empty spaces and imagine a peaceful, silent past. But the reality was loud, crowded, and terrifyingly social. In 2026, we build walls to keep people out. We have personal space, boundaries, and private lives. In medieval Rome, they built walls to keep their own people in. The tower houses were vertical neighborhoods. A girl moving into her husband's home wasn't just moving in with a partner. She was becoming a cog in a defensive machine. If you were a young woman in 1140, your success wasn't measured by your happiness, but by your utility. Did you bring a significant dowry, often in the form of urban property or vineyards outside the walls? Did you provide the sons necessary to man the battlements during the next clash with the Frangipani family? In contrast, the modern Roman woman's success is defined by her autonomy. We have traded the crushing security of the clan for the often lonely freedom of the individual. How did we get from the 13-year-old bride in the mud of 1140 to the modern city of 2026? The transformation was slow and driven by the very thing that sought to control people: the law. Over the next few centuries, the Church's insistence on consensualism, the idea that the two individuals, and only the two individuals, made the marriage, slowly eroded the power of the patriarchs. It was a centuries-long tug-of-war. By the 1300s, we see more records of clandestine or secret marriages where couples exchanged vows in a garden or a tavern, without a priest and without their parents. The Church ironically became the champion of the rebellious lover. By insisting that a marriage was valid the moment two people said, "I marry you," in the present tense, they accidentally created the framework for modern romantic choice. They broke the monopoly of the family tower. As the age of the city-states matured and the violent street wars of the 12th century faded into the more organized commerce of the Renaissance, the architecture changed. Homes became more horizontal. Windows grew larger. The need for a fortress marriage declined as the city's central government grew stronger. The narrow and dark canyons of 1140 were cleared away in the 16th and 17th centuries to make room for the great piazzas we see today. When you stand in the Piazza Navona, you are standing on top of a history of forced I-do's and strategic alliances. The city literally paved over the world of the 13-year-old bride with the monuments of the Age of Reason. What does the 1140 Roman marriage teach us in 2026? It teaches us that consent is not just a word, but a luxury afforded by stability. In a world of chaos, people sacrifice their hearts for the safety of a stone wall and a family name. We look back at the age gap, the lack of hygiene, and the forced consent with a sense of moral superiority. But the medieval Roman might look at us, with our high divorce rates, or our dating apps, and our isolated apartments, and see a society that has lost its sense of duty and communal survival. They lived in a world where every marriage was a bridge between two warring factions. We live in a world where every marriage is a search for self-fulfillment. The city of Rome has survived both versions of the human heart, and its stones remember the whispers of the girls who had no choice, just as clearly as they hear the laughter of the tourists today, who have every choice in the world.